tell me about Forrest Ackerman.
Okay, well, Forrest Ackerman, well, he got started in the field of science fiction, horror, and fantasy journalism and fandom back in the 1920s. He was one of the pioneers. There were very few novels being published about science fiction, and there weren't any comic books yet, and there was no television. But there was one way the fans could get together, and that was through fanzines, and that was through the magazines. Forrest Ackerman discovered this magazine, Amazing Stories, on the newsstand at the corner of Santa Monica and Western in Los Angeles. He noticed in the back of the magazine they had letter columns. The publisher, Hugo Gernsback, was a radio pioneer, and he also thought it was important for people to communicate with each other through the printed word. So he would have people get together through the letter columns. Sometimes they'd say, I would like to correspond with others who were interested in science fiction, as it was called. That's how Forrest J Ackerman met a lot of other people. He befriended folks all over the world. He communicated with some girls who were, as he put it, scarce as pterodactyl teeth in those days. Some of the earliest people he communicated with, Frederick Pohl, who lived in Chicago. They wrote fanzines. Some of them were published out of Chicago. They began to organize clubs. And he communicated with Jerry Siegel, and the other one was Joe Shuster. They've published a fanzine called Science Fiction. The very first Superman story was published in 1933 in Science Fiction. It was called The Superman. It was about an evil Superman, and Clark Kent, not really named in the story, but a fellow named Forrest J. Ackerman was actually named, and he was a reporter. So that was one of Forrest's very earliest forays into fantasy and science fiction. Later on, things began to get better organized, and the fanzines really developed, and they had organizations. They had secretaries, treasurers, and such. And in New York City, one of the bigger fanzines decided they were going to have a convention. And it was the first World Science Fiction Convention. It was held on July 4th, 1939, and it was running concurrently with the New York World's Fair, the first ever in New York City. So Forrest Ackerman came to the Worldcon, was dressed in a futuristic costume that was mostly sewn by his girlfriend, Myrtle Douglas, and she wore a costume too. Well, that was a very momentous Worldcon. Ray Bradbury was able to attend. Ray Bradbury was a boy of Los Angeles. He was a good friend of Forrest Ackerman. They used to meet at the Little Brown Room at Clifton's Cafeteria in Los Angeles, along with some other young fellows like Robert Bloch and Ray Harryhausen. Ray Bradbury was too poor to go to the Worldcon. He wanted to go really badly, but he could not afford it. So Forrest Ackerman paid for his train fare and bought his meals for him while he was there, which he never forgot. He introduced him to some of the publishers, and he met some of the artists as well. Well, that gave Ray Bradbury the inspiration he needed, and he was off and running. He used one of the artists, Virgil Finlay, to illustrate one of his very first stories. And Forrest, meanwhile, was getting involved in not only going to conventions, but also naming the conventions. And he was on every chair of the Pacificons, which were held after that point. The World War II kind of interrupted that a little. But when they all returned from the war, including Forrest, having served in the Army, they began resuming the Pacificons, and you looked at the roster of names at the Pacificon program book, and you'll see Julius Schwartz, who was a mover and shaker at DC Comics, Sam Moskowitz, James Nicholson, producer at AIP. So you see where it all got started. It kind of reminds me of the days in Victorian England where practically all the famous people in science and literature were friends. Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, a patient of Gideon Mantell, who was a medical doctor whose wife discovered the first dinosaur teeth ever scientifically described. Well, I might mention that Forrest was friends with Shel Dorf, who was one of the founders of Comic-Con. So, I mean, things have really changed, and I think for the better.